The beacon wasn't supposed to be there. I've been running the Cashin drift along the Vithrani shelf for 11 days, just me, a two-person survey sled, and enough compressed air to last another week if I didn't do anything stupid. The job was straightforward. Map the seabed geology along the eastern ridge of Oreth Deep for Meridian Extraction's preliminary survey. Log the rock strata, flag any anomalous density pockets that might indicate ore deposits, and head back to the orbital platform before my resupply window closed. I was not supposed to find a city. I almost missed it. The density alarm tripped at 2,300 meters, soft at first, the kind of reading you get from a dense basalt shelf or a compacted sediment column. But the geometry was wrong. Basalt doesn't arrange itself in regular intervals of 11 meters. Sediment doesn't return a sonar echo with right angles. I pulled the sled around and ran the scan again. The city was 3 kilometers wide and 2 deep, nestled into the base of the Oreth Ridge like something pressed there deliberately. Towers that tapered to needle points. Archways that had no business standing after, according to my geological reference scan, at least 4,000 years of ocean pressure. And running along what I could only interpret as a perimeter wall, a steady pulse of blue-white light that was absolutely, categorically, not geological. The beacon. I sat in the sled for a long time after I understood what I was looking at. Then I did the thing every salvage engineer with any sense knows you should never do. I went in. My name is Marcus Vale. I'm 37. I've been doing deep survey and salvage work in the Oreth system for 6 years, which is long enough to know that the Vithrani are not mythological, that they do not appreciate surface contact, and that the stories salvagers tell about their subsea territories being off-limits are not campfire folklore. They are legal fact, registered with the Colonial Survey Authority, and backed by a species that has been spacefaring longer than humanity has been writing things down. None of that stopped me. My only real defense, if it comes to it, is this: the beacon was a distress signal. Old format, pre-colonial band, the kind of pulse pattern the authority classifies as an automatic emergency repeater. I have the logs to prove it. I went in because something inside that city was calling. What I told myself anyway. The entry point was a collapsed archway in the northeast perimeter, a gap maybe 4 meters wide, half blocked by sedimented debris that I could squeeze the sled through sideways if I was careful. I was careful. I got through. The city on the inside was different from the city on the outside. On the outside it looked like ruins, dark still, 4,000 years of ocean doing what ocean does. On the inside it was lit. Not brightly, a cool, blue-gray luminescence that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from channels of something bioluminescent built into the stone. Enough to see by. Enough to understand that the streets were not empty in the way ruins are empty, full of absence. They were empty the way a house is empty when the person who lives in it has just stepped out. I had been inside for maybe 20 minutes, recording everything with every sensor I had, before the current changed. It was subtle, just a shift in the water moving through the streets, a directional pull, gentle but deliberate, the way water moves when something large displaces it elsewhere in an enclosed space. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in a quiet room, not because it's loud, but because the silence was different. I looked up. She was above me, hovering maybe 10 meters overhead, one hand resting against the face of a building the way you'd steady yourself on a wall. Tall, I couldn't judge precisely from below, but tall, with the particular elongated proportions of the deep-adapted Vithrani that I'd only ever seen in Colonial Survey archive photographs. Their limbs were built for water, long, smooth, with a webbing between the fingers that I could see even from this distance. Their skin was the color of deep ocean bioluminescence, a blue so dark it was nearly black, and it was lit from within, not uniformly, but in patterns along the throat and collarbone and down the forearms, soft gold-white channels of living light that pulsed slowly. She was watching me. I did not move. She descended slowly, no rush in it, the way you move when you are in no danger and have nowhere to be and wish to make that clear to the intruder you found in your city. She stopped about 3 meters away, level with me through the sled's viewport, and looked at me with eyes that were entirely black, no visible iris, no white, and absolutely calm. She said something. The sled's translation module gave me noise. I held up both hands, empty, and tried the colonial greeting protocol. Name, species, purpose. Marcus Vale, I said. Human survey, I am sorry, I will leave. She tilted her head. The light patterns at her throat brightened briefly. Curiosity. I would learn later. She said something else, and this time the translation module caught one word in 15 and flagged it as archaic Vithrani. Verath, which in modern dialect meant something between purpose and reason for existence. She was asking me why. Not why I'd come in. Why I existed, perhaps. Or why I'd come here at all, to this world, to this ocean, to this particular city. It wasn't an accusation. It was, I can only describe it as genuine interest, the kind you don't expect from someone who has every reason to throw you out. I said the most honest thing I could think of. I heard the beacon. She was still for a long moment. Then she moved aside and gestured, one long hand extended palm up toward the street ahead, the universal motion I think of this way. I followed her. Her name was Isara Vel-Oreth. I learned this in pieces over the next 2 days, as we worked through the translation barrier with a combination of my module, her patience, and a set of archive tablets she retrieved from a chamber deep in what I came to understand was the city's administrative center, the closest human concept being a palace, though she seemed to find that word inadequate. The tablets were in old Vithrani script, but they cross-referenced a colonial contact dictionary from a survey expedition 400 years prior, and from there, we could build. She was the city's ruler, had been continuously for 230 years, Vithrani biology being what it is, their lifespans measured in centuries, not decades. She had ruled Orath deep since before my great-great-grandmother was born, and she wore it with a particular kind of stillness that I recognized, eventually, as something not unlike loneliness. The city had been sealed by her own order. 210 years ago, following what the tablets described only as the contact failure, a phrase that covered, I would later piece together, a surface world trade negotiation that had gone catastrophically wrong and cost the city a third of its people. She had closed the perimeter, cut the deep city off from the surface world, from the orbital stations, from colonial contact of any kind. Had maintained the seal for over 2 centuries on the principle that isolation was safer than engagement. The beacon had been automatic, a fault in the old emergency system that she hadn't caught, a repeater that had been cycling on a pre-colonial frequency for 6 months without her knowledge. She had not been calling for anyone. And yet, you stayed, I said on the second day, when my translation module had enough Vithrani loaded to carry a real conversation. When you found me inside, you could have made me leave. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? The light in her throat pulsed. You said you heard the beacon. I did. No one has come for 2 centuries. She touched one of the archive tablets, ran a fingertip along the edge of it without looking down. I did not call, but you came. I found that, she paused, searching. Interesting. Interesting. The word is insufficient. She looked at me directly, the way she did when she wanted to make sure the translation landed. In Vithrani there is a distinction, Verathorath, a thing that is interesting in the sense of worth cataloging, and Verathsal, a thing that is interesting in the sense of worth staying for. You were the second kind. I didn't have an answer for that. She seemed unbothered by my silence. On the 3rd day she found the archive. I hadn't known it existed. It was in a section of the administrative complex she hadn't shown me, older than the rest, stone that predated the city's current construction by what she estimated was another 1,000 years. The chamber was full of tablets in a script even she couldn't fully read, and in among them, sealed in a pressure case that had done its job perfectly for 4 centuries, was a cache of colonial-era documents. Survey notes, trade records, and something that had clearly been included by a colonial contact officer who'd had more curiosity than sense, a cultural exchange file. Text, images, some degraded audio. Humans explaining humanity to the Vithrani, apparently at someone's request, in the old contact period before the failure. Isara Vel Oreth read it for 6 hours without stopping. I watched her read. The light in her throat and forearms moved in patterns I was beginning to associate with specific states. The slow pulse of concentration, the quick brightening of surprise, the sustained glow of something I would later understand was called Solizorath, a Vithrani word that translated approximately as the state of being changed by what you have found. She was changed by what she was finding. When she finally looked up, her eyes were fixed on something in the middle distance for a long moment before they settled on me. "Human," she said. "Marcus." "Marcus," she said it carefully. "There is something in these documents, something I have read described but never observed." She looked at me with that absolute dark gaze. "I must see it for myself." I said, "What is it?" She touched the archive document, found the passage she wanted and turned it toward me, though I couldn't read the old script. "It says," she said, "that humans possess a vocal respiratory response to incongruity and delight, an involuntary physical expression. It says," she paused, clearly working with a translation that was giving her trouble. "It says it is the sound your species makes when something is simultaneously surprising and good." I stared at her. "Laughter," I said. "Yes, that word." She looked at me with something that was, I realized slowly, the Vithrani equivalent of intensity. "I want to hear it. I have read that it is impossible to fully understand from description, that it must be experienced to be known." She held the document. The archive officer wrote that he believed it was the most distinctly human thing he had ever encountered. He wrote that no translation was adequate. He wrote, she found the line. He wrote that hearing a human laugh was the only moment in 4 years of contact work when he had felt certain that humanity was something entirely new in the universe. The chamber was very quiet. "You want me to laugh?" I said. "I want to understand it," she said. "There is a difference. I am not asking you to perform. I am asking you to be the thing you are." She set the document down. "If that is possible, I understand it is not controlled." It wasn't controlled. She was right about that. The problem was that nothing about my situation was particularly funny. I was 3,000 meters underwater in a sealed alien city that had been cut off from the surface world for 2 centuries, having a conversation with an alien queen about involuntary human vocal responses. It was many things, but funny was not. Except that she was looking at me with total, focused, scholarly seriousness, the way you look at a rare specimen or a problem you've devoted your life to. And she was asking me, with genuine earnestness and not a trace of condescension, if I could please demonstrate laughter, and there was something about the precision of it, the formality of the request, that was so deeply absurd. It started in my chest. The specific kind of laugh that isn't about something being hilarious, but about something being perfectly wrong, the laugh of a moment that could not possibly have been anticipated. I tried to hold it, out of sheer bewilderment at myself, and that made it worse. And then it was out, and I was laughing in the middle of the deep archive chamber of an alien city, 3,000 meters down, while the Queen of Oreth deep watched me with the most attentive expression I had ever seen on any face, anywhere. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, the kind of laugh that trails off into silence and leaves you slightly embarrassed. When I looked up, Isara Vel Oreth was. She was lit. Not just the usual slow pulse. The bioluminescent channels along her throat and forearms and collarbone were blazing, the gold-white light fully bright for the first time since I'd met her. Her hands were flat on the archive table, and her chin was slightly raised, and she was looking at me with an expression I didn't have the vocabulary to name yet, but would spend the next several days learning to recognize. Verathsal, worth staying for. That, she said very quietly, was not in the description. No. The document said it was a sound. It did not say she stopped. The light in her channels shifted, cycling through something complex. It did not say it changed the room. I looked around the ancient stone chamber, the blue glow of the city beyond its open archway, the water moving silently past the light seams in the walls. I think the room might have already been changing, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Yes, she said, I think it might have been. On the fourth day, she told me about the contact failure. Not because I asked. I had carefully not asked. It felt like the kind of wound you don't probe. But she brought it to the archive chamber in the morning with a directness that I was coming to understand as distinctly Isara. When she decided a thing was worth saying, she said it without preamble. You should know why the city is sealed, she said. If you are going to report what you found here, you should know the full record. I haven't decided what I'm going to report, I said. She looked at me. You should decide, but first the record. The failure was 210 years in the past. A colonial extraction company, not unlike Meridian, the irony of which she acknowledged without bitterness, had approached the city's surface contacts about mining rights to the Oreth Ridge. Standard initial negotiation. The city's council had been cautious but engaged. They had been, she said, perhaps too willing to believe that the surface world's intentions aligned with their own. The extraction company had agreed to the preliminary terms, had sent surveyors with equipment that was not surveying equipment, had moved materials into position on the ridge without disclosure, had, in one night, detonated a series of charges designed to fracture the ridge wall and redirect the current system that the city's thermal exchange relied on. The thermal exchange was what the city used to maintain pressure equilibrium in the lower districts. 1,600 people lived in the lower districts. She told me this calmly, not without feeling. The light in her channels was deep and still, the color of deep water rather than the gold white of emotion, but with the precision of someone who had told the story to herself so many times that the grief had been worn down to fact. 842, she said, in the collapse of the lower exchange. Another 200 in the following months, from conditions. 1,042 of my people, in total. I didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. I closed the city because I believed the surface world was a source of only this kind of loss, she said. I have governed by that belief for 200 years. She looked at the archive tablets. I find that I am now less certain. Because of the documents, I asked. Because of what was in them and because of what came through my perimeter wall. She looked at me with those entirely black eyes, and the light in her throat pulsed once, slow and warm. You heard a beacon that was not a call. You came into a city that was closed. You laughed in my archive chamber. She paused. You are a very strange human. That's a widely held view, I said. The light in her channels brightened. It wasn't laughter, Vithrani biology didn't produce it, but I was learning to read the equivalent. The quickening of the bioluminescent pattern, the slight tilt of the chin, the way her hands relaxed on the table. It was, I thought, the closest thing she had. On the fifth day she asked me to stay. Not permanently, or not in those words. What she said was, the city has been without a record of the surface world for 2 centuries. I find that the gap is significant. I would benefit from a source. A source, I said. A person who knows the current state of things. She looked at me steadily. You would have access to the archive, the city's full record. You would be, she searched, useful to both of us, I think. And my resupply window closes in 3 days. I know. And Meridian Extraction is expecting my survey logs. I know. And there are about 40 different Colonial Survey Authority regulations that apply to this exact situation. I know, she said for the 3rd time with a patience that suggested she had considered all of this more carefully than I had. I am not asking you to disappear. I am asking if you would return, regularly, with a frequency that permits continued contact. She paused. I intend to reopen the city, not immediately, not without structure, but the seal has held for 2 centuries and has not brought back the dead, and I find, she touched the archive tablet, I find that I am tired of certainty. Certainty did not serve my people. Perhaps something else might. Something like what? She looked at me directly. In the light of the archive chamber, the gold-white channels at her throat were steady and full. I do not yet have a word for it, she said. I believe you might help me find one. I sat with that for a long time. The city breathed around us, the slow bioluminescent pulse of the walls, the distant movement of water through channels that 4,000 years of ocean had not managed to stop. Above us, somewhere past 3,000 meters of water, the Cashin drift waited with its survey logs and its compressed air and its resupply window closing in 72 hours. I have to go back, I said, file a report, resupply. Probably deal with Meridian Extraction, deciding I've gone missing. Yes. And then, Isara Vel Orath, Queen of Orath Deep, ruler of a city of 4,200 people who had not seen the surface world in 200 years, looked at me with the light full and bright in her channels. And then, she said, you could come back if you chose. And if I did? She was quiet for a moment. Then perhaps, she said, I would teach you to read the old archive script, and you would teach me, she paused, and there was something in the pause, something careful and unfamiliar and new, other things, the ones that are not in the documents. The archive chamber was very still. I thought about 4,000 years of stone, still standing at the bottom of the ocean because someone had built it well and maintained it carefully. I thought about a beacon cycling on a dead frequency for 6 months until someone happened to be in range. I thought about a woman who had ruled in isolation for 200 years and had, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, decided not to make me leave. I'll come back, I said. The light in her channels went fully bright, all of it from collarbone to fingertip, the warm gold-white blazing steady in the blue of the archive chamber. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There's a word in Old Vithrani. I found it in the archive 3 months later, after I'd come back twice and learned enough of the script to work through the contact period lexicon. Isaravel. The queen had thought it was archaic, out of use for centuries, but it was there in the oldest tablets. It meant the person who changed the current. Not redirected it, not blocked it, changed it, the way something can enter a closed system and alter the direction of everything that moves through it, permanently, without force. I asked her once if she'd known the word before I found it. She was quiet for a moment. We were in the archive chamber, as we usually were by that point, and the city was lit around us the way it always was, and her hands were on the old tablet she'd been translating for the better part of an afternoon. I knew it, she said. And she looked up at me. The light in her channels was the steady, warm, full brightness I'd come to know as something she had, I suspected, never let anyone else see. And I thought it was a word for a thing that did not happen, she said. I no longer think that. Outside the archive chamber, through the corridor and the archways and the streets lit blue-white by the living walls, the city of Orath Deep went on. Not sealed now, the outer perimeter was open, the old emergency repeater properly decommissioned, 2 Colonial Survey Authority liaisons in cautious negotiation with the city's council, about the framework for formal recontact. It was slow, it was careful, it was the kind of work that takes years and might still fail. But the current had changed direction. And I, Marcus Vale, survey engineer, 37 years old, who had spent 6 years doing perfectly ordinary work on a perfectly ordinary ocean world, was sitting in a 4,000-year-old archive at the bottom of the sea next to the woman who ran it, and she was lit, and the water moved around us, and somewhere in the stack of tablets we hadn't reached yet was a lexicon entry I'd found last week that I'd been saving. Varathasara, the old word for the person you change the current for. I was going to show it to her tomorrow. I suspected she already knew it.